At our son's wedding, my husband said, "This dance is for the woman I've secretly loved for 10 years. I wasn't expecting it. I stood before the full-length mirror in my bedroom, my hands trembling as I reached behind my back for the zipper of my mother of the groom dress. The emerald fabric, carefully chosen 6 months ago to complement my graying auburn hair, now stretched tight across my middle. I sucked in my breath and tugged upward. The zipper moved 3 inches and stopped. My reflection stared back at me with eyes I barely recognized anymore. 48 years old. Size 16. The dress had been a size 14 when I bought it, and even then, I'd known I was lying to myself. The chronic pain medication had a cruel sense of humor. It dulled the fire in my lower back and leg just enough to let me function, but it added pounds like interest accumulating on a debt I could never repay. I tugged the zipper again. It wouldn't budge. This was my son's wedding day. Marcus, my beautiful boy who had somehow grown into a man despite having a mother who spent half the last decade in bed or on the couch, clutching heating pads and prescription bottles. I should be radiant today. I should be the mother who danced with grace and laughed without restraint. Instead, I was this woman who couldn't even zip her own dress. The door opened behind me and I flinched. "Ready?" David's voice was gentle, always gentle these days. That carefully modulated tone he used with me now, like I was something fragile that might shatter if he spoke too loud. I met his eyes in the mirror. He looked distinguished in his charcoal tuxedo, his salt and pepper hair freshly cut, his jaw still strong at 51. He could have stepped out of a magazine. I looked like someone who had given up. "The zipper's stuck," I said, hating how small my voice sounded. He crossed the room in 3 strides. I felt his fingers at my back, warm through the thin fabric, and something in my chest tightened. Not pain. Shame. I couldn't remember the last time his touch hadn't felt like pity. The zipper slid up smoothly under his hands. Of course it did. "There," he said, stepping back. "You look nice." "Thanks." I smoothed the front of the dress, avoiding my reflection. "You too." Neither of us made eye contact. We had perfected this dance over the years, this careful choreography of polite distance. He retreated to check his phone. I pretended to adjust my hair. The silence between us was so familiar it had become its own language. My mind drifted, unbidden, to another morning 10 years ago. I had been standing in front of a different mirror then, in my physical therapist's scrubs, pulling my hair into a ponytail before heading to work. I'd been 38, strong, vibrant. I'd coached Marcus's soccer team on weekends, hiked the trails at Red Rock Canyon with David every Sunday morning, spent my weekdays helping patients recover from injuries and surgeries. The irony wasn't lost on me now. The accident had happened on a Tuesday. I remembered that detail with crystalline clarity. Tuesday afternoon, 3:15, driving home from the grocery store with a trunk full of ingredients for Marcus's favorite lasagna. He'd had a chemistry test that day, and I'd wanted to celebrate, regardless of his grade, because that was what mothers did. That was what I did. I never saw the other car coming. The drunk driver ran the red light at 45 miles per hour and hit my sedan broadside. The impact spun my car like a toy. I remembered the sound, metal screaming against metal, glass exploding into diamonds. I remembered my head snapping sideways, the seatbelt cutting across my chest, and then the strange, floating moment when the car stopped moving and I realized I was still alive. The pain came later, first in the ambulance, then in the emergency room, then during the 3 surgeries that followed. The doctors used words like nerve damage and chronic pain and permanent. They said I was lucky. Lucky to be alive. Lucky to walk again, even with a limp. Lucky the paralysis was only temporary. I didn't feel lucky. The surgeries fixed what they could, but my lower back and left leg became a permanent reminder of that Tuesday afternoon. Some days the pain was a dull throb, manageable with medication and ice packs. Other days it was a living thing that wrapped around my spine and squeezed until I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but lie in bed and wait for it to pass. I lost my career first. You can't be a physical therapist when you can't stand for more than an hour without wanting to scream. Then I lost my hobbies one by one. No more hiking, no more coaching soccer, no more weekend adventures with David. The medications made me foggy and tired, and the combination of immobility and pharmaceutical side effects transformed my body into something I didn't recognize. And through it all, I watched David's face during my bad days. Watched the concern morph into something that looked like resignation. Watched him become careful with me, gentle, distant, like I was a responsibility he'd inherited rather than the woman he'd married. "Sarah?" David's voice pulled me back to the present. "We should get going. Marcus wants us there early for photos." "Right. Yes." I grabbed my clutch from the dresser, checking for my pain medication, tissues, lipstick. The essentials for pretending I was fine. The drive to the venue was quiet, punctuated only by the GPS's calm directions and the soft hum of classical music on the radio. David drove with his eyes on the road, one hand on the wheel, and I stared out the window at the passing scenery. Spring had arrived in full force, turning the world green and alive, everything blooming, everything growing, everything except us. The Ashford estate looked like something from a fairy tale. White tents billowed in the gentle breeze, strings of lights crisscrossed overhead waiting for sunset, and clusters of cream and blush roses adorned every surface. Elena had excellent taste. Marcus had chosen well. As we pulled into the parking lot, I saw my son standing near the entrance in his tuxedo, scanning for our car. At 28, Marcus had David's height and my eyes, a combination that had made him startlingly handsome. But it was the way he held himself, confident and open, that made my chest ache with a complicated mixture of pride and grief. He had grown up well despite everything, maybe even because of it. Maybe watching his mother struggle had taught him resilience, empathy, strength. Or maybe I was just telling myself comfortable lies. Marcus spotted our car and waved, his face breaking into that smile that had gotten him out of trouble since he was 3 years old. David parked, and I took a deep breath, preparing my face. The mother of the groom's smile. Warm, happy, present. Not the face of a woman whose marriage had become a hollow shell held together by habit and obligation. "You okay, Mom?" Marcus asked the moment I stepped out of the car. He was always asking that. Had been asking it for 10 years. "Perfect," I lied, pulling him into a hug. "Nervous?" "Terrified," he admitted with a laugh. "But the good kind, you know." I didn't know. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt the good kind of anything. But I smiled and squeezed his hand. "Elena's going to be a beautiful bride." "She already is." His eyes went soft the way they always did when he talked about her. That look of absolute certainty, of joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. I remembered having that look once, a lifetime ago. David clapped Marcus on the shoulder and they fell into easy conversation about the ceremony timeline and the photographer's schedule. I watched them together, my husband and my son, and felt like an outsider looking through a window at a life I used to inhabit. Inside the venue, controlled chaos reigned. The wedding planner, a sharp woman named Victoria, directed traffic with the precision of a general commanding troops. Florists arranged centerpieces. Caterers checked warming trays. Bridesmaids in dusty rose dresses clustered near the bridal suite, their laughter carrying across the space. And there was David, in the middle of it all, charming everyone. I watched him help adjust a crooked backdrop, laugh with the caterers about something I couldn't hear, shake hands with Elena's father like they were old friends. He had always been good with people, comfortable in his own skin in a way I envied. The accident hadn't taken that from him. It had only taken it from me. "Mrs. Mitchell?" The photographer appeared at my elbow, and camera in hand. "We'd love to get some family photos before the ceremony. Is now a good time?" I nodded, following her toward the designated photo area where Marcus and Elena waited. Elena looked radiant in her dress, all ivory lace and glowing skin. She hugged me, smelling of jasmine and happiness. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. "I'm so happy to be joining your family." Guilt twisted in my stomach. What family was she joining? A son who deserved better parents? A father who stayed out of duty? A mother who was barely present even when she was in the same room? The photographer arranged us in various configurations. Marcus with his parents, Elena with her parents, the happy families, together. I smiled until my face hurt, standing carefully to keep the weight off my left leg, praying the pain medication would hold for a few more hours. At one point, David's hand rested on my lower back for a photo, and I felt the old phantom of what used to be. We used to touch like this all the time. Casually, naturally, the way people in love do. His hand on my back in the grocery store, my hand on his arm during dinners out. Small gestures that said we belonged to each other. When had we stopped? I knew when. I just didn't like to think about it. After the photos, I found myself with an hour before the ceremony began. David had disappeared somewhere with Marcus, probably for some father-son moment. I wandered through the venue, pretending to admire the decorations, really just trying to find a quiet corner where I could sit and catch my breath. Near the far end of the tent, I spotted David talking with Elena's mother, Patricia. They stood close together, both laughing at something. Patricia touched his arm, tilting her head, and I felt ice slide down my spine. Was that her? Had he confided in her about his miserable marriage? Were they bonding over what it was like to deal with damaged people? I couldn't hear their conversation, but my mind filled in the blanks with poisonous efficiency. Of course he would seek comfort elsewhere. Of course he would find someone easier than me. Someone who could stand without pain, laugh without medication, exist without being a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. I turned away, my heart hammering, and nearly collided with two bridesmaids. "Oh, sorry!" The blonde one stepped back, adjusting her bouquet. They didn't realize I was close enough to hear. "I can't believe they're still together," the brunette said, her voice low but not low enough. "She looks so, I don't know, sad? And he looks like he could be in a magazine. My mom said there was some accident years ago, but still." "Maybe they're staying together for the son?" the blonde suggested. "People do that. On his wedding day, though? Seems like now they could finally split." Their voices faded as they moved away. Oblivious to the knife they'd just twisted in my gut, I stood frozen, my clutch pressed against my chest like a shield. They were right. We were the obvious mismatch. The man who had everything together and the woman who was falling apart. Everyone could see it. The caterers, the photographer, the random bridesmaids. Everyone except David, who stayed anyway, tied to me by vows he'd made before he knew what forever would actually cost. I needed to get away. I needed air. I needed to not fall apart in the middle of my son's wedding venue. The bathroom was mercifully empty. I locked myself in a stall and let the tears come, silent and hot. My shoulders shook. My breath came in gasps. This was supposed to be a happy day. The happiest day. My son was getting married. I was supposed to be celebrating, not crumbling. But all I could think about was how I'd failed. Failed as a wife. Failed to be someone David could still love. Failed to be the woman he'd married, the one who'd been whole and capable and worth staying for. After a few minutes, I forced myself to stop. I splashed cold water on my face, careful not to ruin my makeup more than I already had. I stared at myself in the mirror and gave myself the same speech I'd been giving for 10 years. Just get through today. For Marcus, you can fall apart tomorrow, next week, next month. But today, you smile. Today, you show up. Today, you be the mother he deserves, even if you can't be the wife David deserves. I reapplied my lipstick with shaking hands and left the bathroom. The ceremony would begin in 30 minutes. I found a quiet corner near the back of the tent and sank into a chair, grateful to get off my leg. The venue had transformed while I'd been hiding. Guests were beginning to arrive, filling the white chairs arranged in neat rows facing the floral arch where Marcus and Elena would exchange their vows. Sitting there, watching people filter in, my mind drifted to another memory I usually kept locked away. 3 months after the accident, the darkest period of my life. I'd been in so much pain that month, trapped in a body that had betrayed me, pumped full of medications that made me feel like I was living underwater. Marcus had been 18, preparing for college, and I'd felt like I was ruining his senior year. David had been patient, so endlessly patient, helping me to the bathroom, bringing me meals, adjusting my pillows, and I'd hated every second of his kindness because it felt like watching him become my nurse instead of my husband. One night, after a particularly bad day when I'd cried from pain for hours and he'd sat beside me holding my hand without complaint, I'd taken out my journal. I hadn't written in it since before the accident, but that night I needed to put my thoughts somewhere before they consumed me. I'd written the words that still haunted me a decade later. I'm not the woman he married. I'm a burden wrapped in pain. I don't know why he doesn't leave. I'd hidden the journal in my nightstand drawer, buried under old receipts and expired coupons, never imagining anyone would find it. And as far as I knew, no one ever had. David never mentioned it. Nothing changed. He stayed, but the distance between us grew wider with each passing year until we became what we were now. Polite strangers sharing a house and a history. The journal was still in that drawer. I occasionally added to it, pouring my grief and self-loathing onto pages no one would ever read. It was the only place I could be completely honest. Sarah? I looked up to find David standing in front of me, adjusting his cufflinks. They're about to start. We should take our seats. I nodded and stood, wincing slightly as weight shifted to my left leg. David offered his arm automatically, and I took it automatically, and we walked down the aisle to the front row automatically. Everything we did these days was automatic. Programmed responses in a marriage that ran on autopilot. The music began. Elena's mother was escorted down the aisle, then my mother, looking frail but happy. The bridesmaids processed in their dusty rose dresses, smiling at the assembled guests. Then Marcus appeared with the officiant, looking nervous and young and so full of hope it made my throat tight. David's hand found mine in my lap. I let him hold it, our fingers intertwined in a gesture that should have felt intimate but only felt like performance. Look, we're still a couple. Look, we still touch each other. Look, we're not completely broken. The wedding march started, and everyone stood. Elena appeared at the back of the aisle, breathtaking in her wedding gown, her father beaming beside her. The guests gasped appropriately. Someone sniffled. The moment was perfect, crystalline, everything a wedding should be, and I felt nothing but a hollow ache. I watched Elena walk toward my son, watched Marcus's face transform when he saw her, watched two people who actually loved each other promise forever, and I couldn't stop the tears. They slid down my cheeks unchecked, and I told myself they were tears of joy, mother of the groom tears, happy tears. But I knew the truth. I was crying for what I'd lost, for the marriage I used to have, for the woman I used to be, for the certainty that I would never have what Marcus and Elena had, standing there looking at each other like they were the only two people in the world. David squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back, and neither of us looked at each other. We kept our eyes on our son, on his happy ending, and pretended we weren't sitting in the wreckage of our own beginning. The ceremony was beautiful. The vows were heartfelt. Marcus's voice cracked when he promised to love Elena in sickness and in health, for better or worse, and I wondered if he understood what those words really meant. If he understood that worse could last for years, could transform everything, could turn love into obligation and passion, into patience and intimacy, into carefully maintained distance. Then it was over. Marcus kissed his bride. Everyone cheered. The happy couple walked back down the aisle, radiant, and David and I followed, still holding hands, still performing our parts. The reception would begin in an hour. Cocktail hour first, then dinner, then the dances, the traditional dances. Father-daughter, mother-son, and then, I assumed, David and I would have to dance together, would have to hold each other, and sway to some romantic song while pretending our marriage wasn't held together by nothing more than history and habit. I dreaded it already, dreaded every moment that was coming. Dreaded having to smile and celebrate and pretend I wasn't dying inside. But I would do it, for Marcus. I would do anything for Marcus. Even if it meant spending one more day pretending my marriage wasn't already over, just waiting for someone to finally acknowledge it out loud. The cocktail hour felt like walking through a dream where everyone else had the script except me. I moved through clusters of guests, accepting congratulations, smiling until my face ached, making small talk that evaporated from my memory the moment the conversations ended. Every interaction felt like a performance, and I was an actress who'd forgotten her lines years ago. "Sarah, darling!" David's Aunt Margaret descended on me near the champagne table, her perfume arriving 3 seconds before she did. She pulled me into a hug that smelled of gardenias and gin. "You two are relationship goals. Still together after everything you've been through. It's so rare these days." I forced my smile wider. "Thank you, Margaret. David's told me how hard it's been," she continued, patting my arm. "But you're both so strong, so committed." Strong, committed. The words felt like stones in my stomach. I excused myself as quickly as politeness allowed and retreated to the edge of the tent, clutching my champagne glass like a lifeline. Near the bar, I overheard one of David's colleagues from work talking to his wife. "David's such a saint, honestly. Not many men would have stayed." The words hit me like a physical blow. I turned away, pretending I hadn't heard, but they echoed in my head. Saint. Stayed. As if my entire existence had become something to endure, a burden he bore with noble grace. I scanned the room and found David across the tent, surrounded by a group of guests. He was laughing at something, his head thrown back, and even from this distance I could see how comfortable he looked. How at ease. Then his eyes found mine across the crowded space, and the laughter faded. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Concern? Probably. Or pity. That was all I ever saw in his eyes anymore. I looked away first. I always looked away first. The transition from cocktail hour to reception happened in a blur of activity. Guests filed into the main tent, finding their assigned seats at tables draped in cream linens and adorned with those beautiful roses. The head table sat on a slight elevation, giving Marcus and Elena, along with the wedding party, a perfect view of the celebration. David and I were seated at a table just below them, close enough to be part of the festivities, far enough to feel separate. Dinner was served. I pushed food around my plate, eating just enough to avoid questions. David sat beside me, and we made polite conversation with the other guests at our table. To anyone watching, we probably looked fine. Normal. A couple married for decades, comfortable in each other's presence. No one could see the vast, empty space between us. After dinner, the DJ's voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming, for the first time as husband and wife, Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Mitchell." The tent erupted in applause as Marcus and Elena entered, hand in hand, their faces glowing. They moved to the center of the dance floor, and the opening notes of their song began. I watched them sway together, Elena's head on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus's hand splayed protectively on her back. They moved as one person, lost in each other, oblivious to the 100 pairs of eyes watching them. Tears spilled down my cheeks. Real ones this time. Because this was beautiful. This was what love looked like when it was new and certain and whole. This was what I'd had once, before the accident, before the pain, before everything broke. "They're perfect together," David whispered beside me. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The song ended, and the DJ announced the father-daughter dance. Elena and her father took the floor, and I dabbed at my eyes with my napkin, trying to pull myself together for what came next. "And now," the DJ said, "we invite the groom and his father to the dance floor for their special dance." David stood, straightening his jacket, and made his way to where Marcus waited. I watched them embrace, then begin to move to the music. The song was one David and Marcus had chosen together, something about a father's love and letting go. From my seat, I could see them talking, their heads close together. Marcus said something that made David's expression crumble for just a moment, then reform into something softer. Marcus whispered something else, and David nodded, his hand gripping Marcus's shoulder. What were they saying? What moment was I missing? The song ended too quickly, and then it was my turn. "Ladies and gentlemen, the mother-son dance." My legs felt unsteady as I stood. Marcus met me halfway, taking my hand and leading me to the dance floor. The opening notes began, and I recognized the song immediately. The same one we'd danced to at his high school graduation party. 8 years ago. A lifetime ago. "Hey, Mom," Marcus said softly as we began to sway. "You doing okay?" "I'm wonderful, I lied. This has been the most beautiful day." "Mom." His voice carried a gentle reproach. "You don't have to do that with me." I looked up at him, this man who used to be my little boy, and felt something crack in my chest. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Really. Mom, I know things have been hard." He pulled me closer, and I felt him take a deep breath. "But I hope you know how much Dad loves you. He tells me all the time." The words should have comforted me. Instead, they felt like another weight added to the pile I was already carrying. "He's a good man," I said carefully. "You're lucky to have him as a role model." Marcus pulled back slightly, looking at me with eyes that saw too much. "Mom, I'm not talking about him being a good father. I'm talking about how he feels about you. I couldn't meet his gaze. I know, honey. I know. But I didn't know. I didn't believe it, how could I? Marcus looked like he wanted to say more, his mouth opening, then closing, then opening again. But the song was ending, and the moment passed. He kissed my cheek and whispered, "I love you, Mom. I love you too, baby." I returned to my seat, my heart hammering, and that's when I noticed David was gone. I scanned the room and spotted him near the DJ booth, leaning in close to say something. The DJ nodded, making a note on his tablet. Then David moved to the wedding planner, Victoria, and they had a brief, intense conversation. She nodded too, glancing at her watch. What was he doing? Then he found Marcus near the head table, and they stepped aside, speaking in low voices. Marcus's expression shifted from curious to serious to something that looked almost like concern. He glanced at me, then back at David, then nodded slowly. My stomach dropped. David kept looking at me. Every few minutes his eyes would find mine across the room, holding my gaze for just a moment before I looked away. But there was something different in his expression tonight. Something I couldn't quite identify. Nervous, maybe. Or guilty. Or sad. Or all three. I felt like I was watching a bomb tick down to zero and couldn't figure out how to leave the building. Elena's sister, Carmen, appeared at my table with a bright smile. "Mrs. Mitchell, your husband asked me to make sure you stayed on the dance floor after the parent dances. He said he has something important to share." The room tilted. "I'm sorry, what?" "He said it's a surprise. A good one." Carmen's smile was so genuine, so unsuspecting. She had no idea she'd just confirmed my worst fear. "Right, of course, thank you." My voice came out steady somehow. Carmen squeezed my shoulder and flitted away, leaving me frozen in my chair. This was it. He was going to do it publicly. He was going to announce whatever he'd been planning, and he'd chosen the most public moment possible because maybe he thought I wouldn't make a scene in front of everyone. Maybe he thought the audience would keep me from falling apart. My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. An affair. It had to be an affair. Someone at his office, maybe. He'd been working late so many nights over the past few months. Or maybe someone from our old life before the accident. Someone he'd reconnected with on one of those solo hikes he still took every Sunday. Someone whole and capable and not broken. Or maybe he was leaving me. Maybe he'd waited until after the wedding to announce it, not wanting to ruin Marcus's day but also unable to keep up the charade any longer. Maybe this was his way of ending it. Clean, public, final. Or maybe, and this thought was almost worse than the others, maybe the secret love was our marriage itself. Maybe he'd planned some grand gesture, some renewal of vows, some public declaration that we were still committed despite everything. But that felt impossible given the miles of distance between us. How could he stand up and declare love for a marriage we both knew was dead? I considered leaving, faking a migraine, claiming my pain medication had worn off, anything to escape before whatever was coming. But I was trapped. Marcus's wedding, 100 guests watching. The mother of the groom couldn't just disappear, so I sat there, my hands trembling in my lap, and waited for the axe to fall. The DJ's voice cut through the ambient conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." The room quieted. Heads turned toward the DJ booth. David Mitchell has a special announcement he'd like to make. My vision narrowed. Everything at the edges went fuzzy, and all I could see was David taking the microphone from the DJ's hand. His hands were shaking slightly. I could see it even from where I sat. He stepped into the center of the dance floor, and the room fell completely silent. Everyone was watching him, waiting. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate Marcus and Elena today," David began, his voice steady despite his shaking hands. "Before we continue with the evening, I need to do something I should have done a long time ago." I couldn't breathe. My hands were ice cold. Marcus and Elena stood near the head table, and they weren't surprised. They knew. They were in on whatever this was. David's eyes found mine across the room. "This next dance," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "is dedicated to the woman I've secretly loved for the past 10 years. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. The words hung in the air, and I felt every eye in the room turn to me. Pitying eyes. Knowing eyes. Eyes that said they'd always suspected, always known that this marriage was a sham. My face burned, my throat closed. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor, to cease to exist. Then I looked at David, really looked at him, and saw that his eyes were filling with tears. For the first time in years, since the accident maybe, I saw David's eyes fill with tears. He started walking toward me. The music began. Soft, familiar notes that I knew as well as my own heartbeat. Our wedding song. The song we'd danced to 29 years ago, young and in love and certain of forever. David was walking toward me, his hand extended, and I didn't understand. I couldn't process what was happening. The woman he'd secretly loved. Our wedding song. His tears. None of it made sense. I sat frozen in my chair, confusion and terror warring in my chest, as my husband crossed the distance between us with an expression on his face I hadn't seen in a decade. An expression that looked almost like hope. David stood in the center of the dance floor, still holding the microphone, and his eyes never left mine. The room remained suspended in that terrible silence, everyone waiting, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't understand what was happening. 10 years ago, David began, his voice trembling but clear. My wife Sarah was in an accident that changed our lives. No. He wasn't going to do this. He wasn't going to talk about the accident in front of all these people. I wanted to stand up, to run, but my legs had turned to stone. What most of you don't know, he continued, is that it changed more than just her body. Oh God, this was worse than anything I'd imagined. Public humiliation dressed up as a speech. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white. She became someone new, someone she didn't recognize. His voice caught. Someone she thought I couldn't love. Tears were streaming down his face now, and I realized I was crying too. Crying from shame, from horror, from the desperate wish that I could disappear. 3 months after the accident, I found her journal. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for her insurance card in her nightstand, and there it was. I knew I shouldn't read it, but I did. My heart stopped. The journal. He'd found the journal. She'd written something that broke my heart. She wrote that she wasn't the woman I married anymore, that she was a burden wrapped in pain, that she didn't know why I didn't leave. I heard gasps around the room, felt the weight of 100 pitying gazes. This was my private hell, my darkest moment, being shared with everyone I knew. That night, David said, his voice stronger now, I made a promise to myself. I would fall in love with the woman she was becoming, not mourn the woman she'd been before. Wait, what? But I would do it silently, because I didn't want her to think my love was charity. I didn't want her to feel like I was staying out of pity or obligation. I wanted her to see that I loved her, truly loved her for who she was, not who she used to be. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the table harder, but she couldn't see it. She was so convinced she'd lost everything, lost herself, that she couldn't see what I saw. David took a shaky breath. She couldn't see the morning she forced herself to walk to the mailbox, even though every step was agony, because she refused to give up. I watched from the window, and I'd never been more proud of anyone in my life. That morning. I remembered that morning. 6 years ago, maybe 7. A bad pain day, but I'd been determined to do something, anything, to feel capable. I thought I was alone. She couldn't see the day she spent 4 hours baking Marcus's favorite chocolate chip cookies, even though standing made her want to scream, because it was his birthday, and she wanted him to feel celebrated. David's voice broke. I came home and found her sitting on the kitchen floor in tears, surrounded by cooling cookies, and she apologized. She apologized for making a mess. She couldn't see that what she'd done was an act of pure love. Oh God, his 23rd birthday, I remembered. I'd been so embarrassed that he'd found me like that. She couldn't see the night she laughed at a terrible joke on a sitcom, even though she was exhausted from pain, because she was trying so hard to feel joy again, to not let the pain take everything. David wiped his eyes. She thought I didn't notice, but I noticed everything. The room was completely silent except for the sound of crying. I realized some of it was mine. Every time she apologized for gaining weight, she couldn't see that I found her courage more beautiful than any physical feature. Every time she said she was sorry for being tired, for being in pain, for not being who she used to be, I wanted to tell her that the woman she'd become was the strongest person I'd ever known. The journal entries didn't stop after that first one, David continued. Over the years, she kept writing, kept pouring out her pain and her fears and her belief that I would eventually leave. And I kept reading them, always putting them back exactly where I found them, learning who she was inside. Learning how to love her better, even if she couldn't see it. He'd read all of them, every entry, every moment of weakness and despair and self-loathing. He'd seen it all. "You thought I stayed out of obligation," David said, looking directly at me now. "The truth is, I fell more in love with you than I ever thought possible. The world stopped spinning. The woman I married was wonderful," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the woman you became, Sarah, the one who fights through pain every single day, the one who rebuilt herself from nothing, the one who raised our son to be the man standing here today, getting married to the love of his life. She's the woman I've secretly loved for 10 years. I couldn't see through my tears, couldn't process what I was hearing. Secret because you refused to see it. Secret because every time I tried to tell you, you deflected or changed the subject. Secret because you stopped believing you were worthy of being loved." Images flashed through my mind, memories reframing themselves in real time. David working late. I'd assumed he was avoiding me, finding excuses to stay away. But now I remembered coming home once to find research papers about pain management scattered across his desk. Articles about chronic pain and depression and new treatments. I thought he was just being thorough, doing research for someone at work maybe. It had been for me. David going hiking alone every Sunday. I'd been convinced he was reliving the life he used to have, escaping the invalid wife at home. But I remembered him coming back with his phone full of photos, trees and trails and sunrise views. "Look how beautiful it was," he'd say, showing me the images. "I wish you could have been there." He'd been showing me that beauty still existed, that the world I'd loved was still there, waiting for me to be ready to see it again. David's distant behavior. The careful way he spoke to me, the space he gave me, the way he never pushed when I withdrew. I'd interpreted it as pulling away. But what if it wasn't withdrawal? What if it was him trying not to smother me? Trying to give me room to heal without making me feel crowded or pitied? Every "you look nice" I dismissed as hollow pleasantries. What if they weren't? What if he'd meant every single one, and I'd been too buried in self-hatred to hear the truth behind them? "May I have this dance?" David said, his voice breaking. "With the woman I've secretly loved for 10 years. He stood there, hand extended, tears on his face, and I finally understood. He wasn't leaving me. He wasn't announcing an affair. He wasn't publicly humiliating me. He was declaring his love. For me. For the woman I'd become. For the person I thought no one could love. I stood on shaking legs. The distance between my table and the dance floor felt like miles, but I crossed it somehow. My hand found his, and his fingers closed around mine, warm and sure and real. He pulled me close as our wedding song swelled around us. His hand settled on my lower back, in the exact same spot it had been 29 years ago. My head found his shoulder, fitting in that familiar space I'd forgotten existed. We swayed together, and for the first time in a decade, it didn't feel like performance. It felt like coming home. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered against his shoulder, my voice raw. "I tried," he said softly. 100 times, but you couldn't hear it. You were too busy hating yourself to let me love you. The truth of it hit me like a wave. How many times had he said something kind and I'd brushed it off? How many gestures had I misinterpreted? How many years had I spent building walls to protect myself from abandonment that was never coming? "I wasted so much time," I choked out. "Thinking you wanted to leave. Thinking I was a burden. Thinking you stayed out of obligation." His arms tightened around me. "I was waiting for you to let me back in. I'm still waiting." I pulled back enough to look at his face. His eyes were red from crying, his expression raw and open in a way I hadn't seen in years. This was David. My David. Not the careful, distant stranger I'd convinced myself he'd become. He'd been there all along. I just hadn't been able to see him. I'm sorry, I sobbed. I'm so sorry. I've been so stupid, so blind. Don't be sorry, he said, cupping my face in his hands. Just come back to me. Let me love the woman you are now. I broke then, completely. 10 years of grief and pain and self-loathing poured out of me in racking sobs. David held me through it, there in the middle of the dance floor, in front of everyone. He didn't try to quiet me or rush me. He just held me, swaying gently to the music, letting me fall apart in his arms. The song ended, but we didn't separate. Couldn't separate. Then I felt another set of arms around us both. Marcus. Our son wrapped us both in a fierce hug, and I felt him shaking with his own tears. About time, you two, he said, his voice thick. I laughed through my sobs. You knew? Dad told me a few years ago, Marcus admitted. Made me promise not to interfere. Said you had to find your way back to him on your own. But God, Mom, it's been killing me watching you both suffer. I looked at David, at our son, at the life I'd almost thrown away because I couldn't see past my own pain. I've been such a fool. You've been hurt, David corrected gently. There's a difference. Around us, the reception had erupted into applause and cheers. Guests were crying, including David's Aunt Margaret, who was openly weeping into her napkin. Elena's mother dabbed at her eyes. Even the DJ looked emotional, but I barely noticed them. All I could see was my husband, my son, the family I'd thought I'd lost but had been there all along. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of emotion. Guests approached us all night, hugging us, crying with us, sharing their own stories of struggle and survival. The wedding became something more than a celebration of Marcus and Elena. It became a celebration of love that endures, of marriages that survive, of the choice to keep choosing each other even when it's hard. David and I danced 3 more times that night. Each time, it felt like learning an old dance we'd forgotten. Our bodies remembered how to move together, even if our hearts had forgotten how to trust. At one point, late in the evening, I caught Marcus watching us from across the room. He raised his champagne glass to me, and I saw such relief and joy on his face that fresh tears spilled down my cheeks. Elena hugged me in the bathroom later, her wedding dress rustling. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For showing me what marriage really means. Not just the beginning, but the middle, the hard parts, the choosing to stay." She pulled back, her own eyes damp. "That's the real love story." When David and I finally left the reception, walking to our car in the quiet parking lot, he took my hand. Just that simple gesture felt like a miracle. "Can we go home?" I asked. "Where else would we go?" "Home," I repeated. "Together. Always together," he said. 3 months later, I sat in my journal with David beside me on the couch. Not reading over my shoulder, not invading my privacy, but there, present. Available if I wanted to share. I'd been writing about our therapy sessions. We'd started couples counseling 2 weeks after the wedding, and it had been hard. Brutal, sometimes, excavating years of misunderstanding and pain and walls we'd both built. But we were doing it. Together. I'd also been writing about the small victories. The day I walked around the block without my cane. The night we'd laughed until we cried over a stupid movie. The morning I'd woken up and realized the chronic pain was still there, would always be there, but it didn't define me anymore. "Want to read it?" I asked, holding out the journal. David took it carefully, like it was something precious. His eyes scanned the page, and a slow smile spread across his face. "This is beautiful, Sarah." "Your turn," I said, handing him a pen. "Write something back." He'd been doing this for the past month, responding to my entries with his own thoughts, creating a dialogue where before there had only been my monologue of pain. He wrote for a few minutes, then showed me. "You walked around the block today." "I walked beside you, and I've never been more grateful for a simple walk. Not because you could do it, though I'm proud of you, but because you let me be there with you. You're letting me back in, piece by piece, and every piece is a gift. I love you. I have always loved you. I will always love you." I leaned my head on his shoulder, fitting into that space that was mine alone. "Want to try something crazy next weekend?" "How crazy?" "There's a trail at Red Rock. Short one, mostly flat. I looked it up. I thought maybe with my walking stick and if you're patient we could try. I felt him tense with surprise, then relax. Really? Really? I'm not the same person who used to hike those trails. I'll be slower. I'll need breaks. I might not make it very far. I took a breath. But I want to try. With you. I would love that, he said, his voice thick. We'll go as slow as you need. We'll rest as much as you want. And Sarah? Yeah? You're right. You're not the same person who used to hike those trails. He kissed the top of my head. You're stronger. The next Sunday we stood at the trailhead together. I had my walking stick, comfortable shoes, and enough pain medication to get me through. David had water, snacks, and infinite patience. We started walking. Slowly. So much slower than I used to move. But I was moving, and he was beside me. Not ahead, not behind, but beside me. 50 feet in, I had to stop and rest. Sorry, I said automatically. Don't, David said gently. No more apologizing for things that don't need apologies. Right. Old habit. We walked another 100 feet. The morning sun filtered through the trees, and the desert air smelled of sage and possibility. My leg ached, but it was bearable. And more than that, it didn't matter as much. The pain was there, but so was David. So was the beauty around us. So was the life I'd almost convinced myself was over. When we reached a scenic overlook, maybe a quarter-mile in, I stopped and stared at the view. Red rocks glowed in the morning light. The valley stretched out below us, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Thank you, I said. For what? For not giving up on me. For loving me when I couldn't love myself. For seeing who I was becoming when all I could see was who I'd lost. David pulled me close, and we stood there together, looking out at the world that had seemed so unreachable for so long. That night, I opened my journal and wrote, Today I realized something. I didn't lose myself 10 years ago. I became someone new. Someone I didn't recognize at first. Someone I fought against. Someone I was convinced no one could love. But he loved her all along. And now, finally, I'm learning to love her too. I closed the journal and set it on the nightstand. Not hidden, not buried. Just there, visible, accessible. No more secrets, no more walls. David came into the bedroom, fresh from his shower, and saw me looking at the journal. New entry? He asked. Want to read it? He sat beside me on the bed and read my words. When he finished, he didn't say anything. He just pulled me into his arms and held me, and I held him back. We stayed like that for a long time. Two people who'd found their way back to each other through a decade of pain and misunderstanding and silent love. Not the people we were when we got married. Not the people we were before the accident. But the people we were now, scars and all, choosing each other again. And that, I finally understood, was the real love story.